The cabin did not appear on any survey he had seen. That was the first thing that made him trust it. Callum Reed had been moving through the upper Cascades for 11 days by the time he found the structure, not looking for it, not expecting it, simply following the logic of the terrain the way a man follows a river, because it is going somewhere, and the effort of following it is less than the effort of deciding where to go yourself. He was 23 years old and between situations in the particular way that young men in that country sometimes found themselves between situations, not lost, not destitute, but unattached to any fixed point in a way that felt more like freedom than it probably was. The cabin sat in a shallow draw off the main drainage, set back into the tree line at an angle that caught the afternoon light but shed the prevailing weather. The roof was intact, a detail he noted first, because intact roofs on abandoned structures in mountain country were not something to take for granted. The walls were hand-hewn timber, checked and gray with age, but solid in the way that things built with patience rather than speed tend to remain solid long after the builder is gone. The door was unlocked. He stood in the doorframe for a moment before entering, the way a careful person stands at the threshold of something unfamiliar, not from superstition, but from the practical habit of taking inventory before committing to a position. What he saw stopped him. The floor. Not the walls, not the stove, not the shelves of goods he would not fully register until later. The floor held him first. River stones, set tight into the earth in a pattern that was not random and not quite symmetrical, but had the quality of something done with sustained intention. Flat stones, most of them the size of a man's hand, fitted together with a patience that must have required a specific kind of person, the kind who did not mind a task that measured its progress in inches rather than hours. He liked knowing the weight of things. He crossed the threshold and crouched down and pressed both palms flat against the stone surface the way his thumbnail shows him, not checking for something specific, but receiving information. The stones were cool, not cold. There was a depth to the temperature, a steadiness, that was different from the cold of the air outside or the cold of bare earth. It was the cold of something that had stored itself. He did not understand yet what that meant. But he stayed. He spent the first hour taking inventory the way he took inventory of everything, methodically, without hurry, touching each thing and placing it in a mental category before moving to the next. The stove was a box design, cast iron, older than he was but functional. The flue drew cleanly when he tested it with a piece of paper. The firebox had been cleaned out by someone at some point, not recently, but deliberately, the kind of cleaning that happens when a person intends to return and wants to find things in order when they do. The shelves along the east wall held canned goods, commercial tins, and also home canned jars, sealed with wax, labeled in a handwriting that was careful and small. Root vegetables in a box below the lowest shelf, drier than they had any right to be, which told him something about the humidity in this room. Tools hung from pegs in a sequence that suggested a person who knew which tool they would reach for first and had arranged things accordingly. He noted all of it. What he kept returning to was the floor. He had seen stone floors before, flagstone in farmhouses, rough-set slate in root cellars. What this was not was either of those things. The river stones had been chosen for uniformity of thickness, not size, not color, but thickness, so that the surface they produced was level within a margin that would have been difficult to achieve without considerable effort and a good eye. The gaps between stones had been filled with a mixture of sand and fine clay that had settled and hardened over years into something close to grout. Along the south wall, nearest the stove, the stones were a different color from the rest. Not stained, not damaged, just different, the particular variation in stone that occurs when a surface has been heated and cooled repeatedly over a long period of time. Those stones had absorbed something. He built a fire. He built it small and efficient the way a man builds a fire when he is being careful with someone else's wood, and does not yet know how long he will be staying. The stove drew well. The cabin warmed without the uneven heat and cold pocket problem that plagued most single-room structures of this size. And within an hour the temperature inside was comfortable in a way that seemed disproportionate to the size of the fire he had made. He put his hand back on the floor near the stove. The stones were warm. Not hot, warm. The kind of warmth that comes not from direct heat but from absorbed heat, stored heat, the warmth of a thing that has been holding something in reserve and is now releasing it at the rate it chooses rather than the rate the fire demands. He sat back on his heels and looked at the floor for a long time. Someone had built this, he thought. Not assembled it, built it. There was a difference, and the difference was intention, and the intention here was legible in every stone. The question was who? The storm came down on the third night. He had stayed longer than he meant to, which was not unusual for him, and which he had long since stopped apologizing to himself about. The cabin held something worth understanding, and he had not yet finished understanding it, and that was reason enough. The temperature dropped 17 degrees between sunset and midnight. He knew this not because he had an instrument, but because he could read the change in the sound the timber made, the particular tightening creak of wood contracting in cold that a person learns to interpret after enough winters in enough structures. He had enough wood for the night. He used less than he expected to. The floor was the reason. What the builder of this cabin had understood, and what Callum worked out across the length of that first cold night, lying on a bedroll with one hand resting against the stone surface, and his mind moving through it the way a mind moves through a problem it finds genuinely interesting, was that the floor was not decoration and not simply a practical surface. It was a thermal system. River stones carried from moving water have a density and a specific heat capacity that most building materials do not match. Packed tight into the earth beneath a structure, with enough mass and enough depth, they function as a battery. The fire charges them. The stones hold the charge. And when the fire burns low or goes out entirely, the stones continue releasing what they absorbed, slowly, evenly, for hours longer than the fire itself would have lasted. The builder had understood this. He had not stumbled onto it. The selection of stones for uniform thickness, the careful fitting to minimize air gaps, the positioning of the densest section directly adjacent to the stove, none of that was accidental. Someone had planned this floor the way an engineer plans a system, which meant someone had either learned this principle from another person who understood it, or had worked it out through the particular combination of curiosity, cold, and consequence that produces genuine knowledge. Someone had built this line with patience and real craft. By the time the coldest hour came, the hour before dawn, when the temperature outside had reached the kind of number that records get written about, the fire had been banked for 3 hours and the interior of the cabin was still warm. Not comfortable evening warm. Not warm like summer, but warm in the specific sense of survivable, of sufficient, of a human body maintaining its temperature without distress. He pressed both palms flat against the floor. The stones were still releasing. He thought about the person who had made this, who had hauled these specific stones from the river below, had sorted them by hand for the right thickness, had laid them one by one into prepared earth and packed the gaps, and understood all along that the payment for this work was not immediate, but would arrive eventually on a night exactly like this one. That was a particular kind of thinking. Not common thinking, not the thinking of a person who builds for the present moment. The thinking of a person who builds for the moment they cannot yet see, the moment someone else might need what they are making, on a night colder than usual, alone in a mountain cabin with the temperature dropping outside, and the question of whether what is holding will continue to hold. The deeper question was why. He found the notebook on the 4th day, tucked into a gap between the back of the lowest shelf and the east wall, not hidden exactly, but placed in the way that things are placed when someone wants them found by the right person rather than the first person. It was a small field book, water-stained, the cover worn soft with handling. The handwriting inside was the same careful small script as the jar labels. He sat by the window with the light coming in at an angle and read it slowly, the way it had been written, not quickly, not impatiently, but with the understanding that some things give up their meaning only to the reader who is willing to take the time. The entries were not a journal in the personal sense. There were no accounts of feelings or relationships or the daily texture of a life. They were observations, temperature readings taken at floor level and at standing height, recorded morning and evening across 2 full winters. Comparisons between nights when the fire was maintained and nights when it was allowed to bank. Notes on which stones retained heat longest and what he believed the cause to be. There was a name at the front of the book, D. Callahan, nothing else. There was also, pressed between the last 2 pages, a small tintype photograph, 3 men standing in front of a structure that was not this cabin but shared its proportions, its low profile, its sense of having been set into the landscape rather than placed on top of it. The men were not identified. The image was dated on the back in pencil, 1923. He didn't know what that meant yet. But he turned the photograph over twice and looked at the structure in the background and noted the same floor-level stonework visible through the open doorway, and understood that D. Callahan had not invented this system at this location. He had carried it here from somewhere else, or had learned it from someone, and the men in the photograph were part of that somewhere else. Between the pages at the front of the notebook, he found a list. 7 locations. Mountain names he recognized and mountain names he did not. Each entry had a date beside it and a short notation, good stone, south draw, tight construction, that read like the assessment notes of a man who had visited each place and evaluated what he found. The last entry on the list was this location, identified only by the drainage name and the elevation. Beside it, D. Callahan had written 2 words. Best one. Someone had wanted this place to exist without anyone knowing it existed. Someone had built it, documented it, noted it as the finest example of something they had spent years refining, and then left it here in a mountain draw off an unmapped trail with a notebook tucked behind a shelf and a photograph between the pages and the door unlocked. The answer would come. He set the notebook on the shelf and went outside and stood at the edge of the draw and looked at the drainage below where the river stones had come from. And he thought about a man named D. Callahan hauling stones up this slope in some year between the photograph and now, selecting them by thickness, fitting them one by one into the earth of this floor. And he found that the more he understood about what had been built here, the less he understood about why. And that the gap between those 2 things was not frustrating but interesting. He went back inside. He started reading the notebook from the beginning. The last page was loose. It had been placed inside the back cover rather than written into the notebook itself, which told him it had been added after. A final entry made separately and inserted, the way a person adds a postscript to a letter when they have sealed it, and then thought of something that cannot be left out. The handwriting was the same but slightly less steady, older perhaps, or cold. He held it closer to the window. It read in full. The floor will hold for a long time if it's left alone. The stones from the second bend below the 3 rock formation are the right thickness. The far east corner runs cold in January. 1 more layer there would fix it. The stove draws best when the damper is set at 2/3, not full open. The jar on the 3rd shelf, no label, is blackberry. It's better than it looks. If you found this you were looking, that's enough. He sat with that for a long time. He was not sure what he had expected. A name, an explanation, an account of why a man had spent years building and documenting stone-floored shelters in mountain draws, and then left them unlocked and unannounced and available to whoever arrived cold and curious enough to understand what they had found. What he had gotten instead was practical. Instructions. A note about a cold corner and a damper setting, and a jar of unlabeled blackberry preserves. And then that final line. If you found this, you were looking, That's enough. He read it 3 times. He did not fully understand it, and he did not try to. He understood enough that D. Callahan had built this place for someone, not for a specific person, not for a family member or a known associate, but for the category of person who would arrive at an unmapped cabin on an overgrown trail in the upper Cascades and notice the floor and stay long enough to understand it. Who would read a notebook of temperature observations with genuine interest? Who would look at a photograph of 3 unknown men and a stone-floored structure and feel the weight of a continuity that they had just become part of? The coldest night arrived on the 6th day. He had not planned to stay that long. He had a general direction and a general destination, and neither of them had become more urgent in the days he had spent in the cabin, which he took as information about the relative importance of both. He was warm and he was occupied, and the notebook still had sections he had not fully worked through, and those were sufficient reasons. The temperature that night reached the lowest recorded figure in that range in 40 years. He learned this later. From a ranger station log he read the following spring, and the number confirmed what his body had already told him, that what he had experienced in the cabin was not ordinary cold management, but something at the far edge of what the circumstances required. He built the fire at 7 in the evening. He banked it at 11. The floor released its warmth through the night without interruption, in the way that a good fire behaves when it has found its rhythm. Not dramatically, not in bursts, but steadily and without hurry, the way a thing behaves when it was built for exactly this. He woke at 5 in the morning to a cabin that was cold in the acceptable sense, not dangerous, not the cold that moves into fingers and changes a person's thinking. The stones beneath his bedroll were still faintly warm. He lay there in the dark and understood, fully and without any remaining ambiguity, what D. Callahan had built and why the notebook called this location the best one. The east corner ran cold. He had noticed it the first night, and he noticed it again now. The temperature differential was small but legible, the kind of thing you would not notice unless you spent enough time close to the floor to feel it, which most people would not. He thought about the note. One more layer there would fix it. He spent the morning laying additional stones in the east corner. He found the right ones at the second bend of the river below, at the 3 rock formation that the note had identified, selected by thickness the way the notebook described, fitted into the gaps in the existing work with the same care he had observed in the original laying. He was not a mason. He was not a builder, but the notebook had given him enough to work from, and the work itself was straightforward once he understood its logic. He added a page to the notebook when he was finished. Date, temperature readings, notes on the east corner modification, and the results. His name, first name only, because that was what the notebook called for, and he understood by now what kind of document it was. He tucked it back behind the shelf where he had found it. He checked the jar on the 3rd shelf. It was, in fact, better than it looked. He set the door the way he had found it, unlocked, closed but not latched, and stood at the edge of the drawer for a moment before starting down toward the drainage, looking back at the low timber structure set into the slope, invisible to anyone who was not already looking for it, available to anyone who was. He had arrived cold and curious, and between situations. He was leaving with a floor he understood, and a name, D. Callahan, that he would carry with him without knowing what to do with it, and a sentence he had read by firelight 3 times on a cold evening in a mountain cabin that had been built by someone who understood the most important thing about the kind of person who finds unmarked shelters on unmapped trails. If you found this you were looking, that's enough. He went down toward the river and did not look back a second time. Some things do not need to be looked at twice. They only need to be taken care of.